Hey everyone, today we're looking over 10 overpowered perks from DBD history. Let's get into it. Sprint Burst in its release date was very powerful, and even after a series of nerfs was still very good, this lasting up to the current day. Back then, Sprint Burst had a 20-second cooldown, and had the exact same effect as today with 150% movement speed for 3 seconds. 20-second recovery is of course already very strong, however, it's accentuated by the fact that Exhausted as an effect used to be recoverable whilst you were running, which made you able to get back your sprint burst mid-chase with ease. It was changed fairly quickly though in patch 1.0.2, however only adding an additional 20 seconds, up to 40. It then was changed in 1.3.0 to double the recovery time whilst running, meaning you could still recover from exhausted whilst running, only it would take 80 seconds. However, it got somewhat of a buff too, where if you crouched it would speed up by 33%. It was only finally in patch 2.1.0 when recovery of exhausted whilst running was finally removed, over 2 years later from that original state. So this is kind of a PSA that we should be grateful for how quick they are with adjustments nowadays. I may not agree with every change they do, but they undoubtedly are much faster these days, and I'm sure you will appreciate that. Small Game is a perk that you may not have expected to see here, and it's debatable if it deserves a spot, as it was largely overpowered due to the context of the time it was in. However, that kind of does apply to most perks here to some extent. This perk was highly powerful in the very early days, and specifically against Trapper, as technically it was only usable against him, but essentially removed his power entirely. This perk gave the very simple effect of revealing the auras of bear traps whenever you were within 6 meters of one. This had no side effects or cooldown, you would just see Trapper's power, basically. This made an entire character out of the only 3 available at the time completely irrelevant. This was debatably even stronger when more characters came to the game. It was reworked to apply to all available traps, revealing the location of bear traps, phantasm traps, and dream pallets, and had an extended 12-meter range. However, it did so with a sound cue instead, making it a bit harder to find them. However, it undoubtedly still was a huge counter to the 3 of these characters. Boon's Circle of Healing has had quite a few changes despite it only really being out for a couple of years. If this perk had released in the early days, it would likely have remained overpowered for a whole lot longer. Now with behavior's faster changes and adjustments though, it only really remained in its full potential for a much shorter period of time. Circle of Healing was strongest in the 5.3.0 PTB. Originally, Circle gave a 100% boost to healing speeds when in its radius, and allowed you to self-heal when inside, but at a 50% reduced rate. One of the stronger parts of the PTB version though was the overlap effect. If correctly placed, you could have multiple boons able to cross over, allowing for very fast healing speeds. This was partly down to the range originally being 28 meters instead of the current 24. Admittedly, this was not exactly a plausible thing to be done during a regular game. However, there was still easy potential for it to be done with, say, 2 boons, giving, I believe, a 200% boost to healing speeds, but something like 4, not so likely. The overlap was removed when it came to the live version, however the perk was still very powerful, and through the years was slowly nerfed down by increments of 25% until it hit 50%. Before it was reworked to its current state in 6.7.0. Overcharge is kind of a sad one because for the longest time it was really bad, with its only effect being the ability to apply a difficult skill check onto a generator after kicking it, and a small extra bit of regression for missing the skill check, but that was only if they missed it. In 6.1.0, this was reworked to have a much more powerful effect. It still applied the skill check, and still the extra regression if you missed it, but it would also apply an effect that would absolutely shred generator progress. Across the course of 30 seconds, it would initially have a 75% extra regression speed after a kick, up to a whopping 200%. This was even higher back in the PTB, when it had an initial 100% up to a peak 400% regression, which is undoubtedly overpowered, and they were definitely correct to change that. It's been fairly substantially nerfed nowadays, only giving up to a peak of 135% regression. This was a fairly odd decision still, at 200%, as in the same patch it had just replaced the old Hex Ruin, which gave a 200% regression. It's almost just like exchanging one for for the other. This change to Overcharge was one of the main reasons we entered a big gen kick meta, and a period of time when 3-genning was particularly punishing. Saboteur is a somewhat niche or gimmicky perk nowadays, that you mostly use if you're going for a fun build where you try to save teammates. It has a fairly punishing effect nowadays with its 60-second cooldown that disallows you from removing hooks back to back. Saboteur was somewhat a product of its time too, with hooks and even Trapper's traps originally being able to be completely removed from the trial when sabotaged. This of course made the perk Saboteur very powerful, with its ability to remove all hooks from the game, with the only unsabotageable ones being the basement hooks. To counter this, sabotaging did take a bit longer originally, I believe around 8 seconds, and also had skill checks. However, considering you could just straight up remove hooks and Trapper's traps from the game entirely, the downside is certainly a small one in comparison. Over the years after that, it was slowly nerfed down to its current state where, again, it's kind of niche and more gimmicky, but it's definitely fun. Borrowed time nowadays has been nerfed quite heavily as a result of being implemented into the Survivor base kit. Nowadays, if you unhook someone, you apply a borrowed time endurance effect onto survivors you save, which makes the slightly longer time you get from actually running borrowed time very little. It can occasionally get you a little value, but largely it's really not going to do much. Borrowed time prior to this change was pretty powerful, and I would say overpowered, considering how if you didn't have it, it would make camping and tunneling insanely easy for the killer. It's had multiple stages really of being highly strong, so let's look over them. In 4.7.0 it gave a 12-second long effect, and it wasn't affected by the terror radius like it used to be. Its strongest state debatably though was the release version in 1.4.2. It made it into a different type of perk, but definitely still a very strong one. Back then, borrowed time was a once per trial use perk. However, it had a 20-second duration of endurance when active, and further applied to both the unhooked and the unhooker, meaning with correct timing, you could quite easily save someone, even from some of the most dire situations, as you would both be protected by endurance. This too was prior to the existence of what is now known as the deep wound mechanic, and so back then it instead gave a bleed out timer of 45 seconds, which works in a similar way, but regardless a longer time. What version do you think was stronger? Iron Grasp is one you might not expect to see, but originally this perk was pretty strong actually. The time it takes to wiggle from the killer's grasp is 16 seconds, which is already quite a long time. However, Iron Grasp in its original state would add an additional 60%, making it 25.6 seconds. It also had the current day effect that it still remains with, a 75% reduction to the effect of survivor wiggling. Over 25 seconds is a really long time, as mentioned before with Saboteur, and its ability to remove hooks from the trial aside basement. This made Iron Grasp pretty invaluable, because it would actually allow you to hook people if many of the hooks had been removed. This perk would be able to save a game that had otherwise been pretty destroyed by the hooks all being sabotaged, or even a large portion of them. It's debatable whether this should be considered overpowered, and it's definitely a product of its time with Saboteur being so strong. Then again, it's a pretty powerful counter to it, with over 25 seconds allowing you to traverse across almost the entire map in most cases. Iron Will is a perk I find really sad, because although it was very strong and probably overpowered, it still felt like you needed some skill to use it properly and reach its full potential. This perk currently reduces injured noises by 75%, and doesn't work if you're exhausted. This heavily nerfed the perk. The issue with this perk is that anything below 100% just makes it kind of suck, because for the most part, even at a 75% reduction, you can still hear survivors most of the time. Originally, this perk gave a 100% reduction to noise, and had no downside of not working when exhausted. It further was able to counter perks such as Strider, which for a long time was able to counter it, before it was eventually changed so that you weren't able to. nullifying the perk entirely. Strider was often used on Spirit to counter Iron Will, as this would counter her. After this change, it was probably one of the most viable ways to counter her at the time, where at the time she was largely uncounterable, making it even stronger. I do miss this perk, but ultimately it was very overpowered, but in some ways a necessity for its time. A nurse's cooling has always been pretty decent, being a perk that reveals the auras of survivors being healed or healing. For one, it was slightly more powerful with its aura range being 32 meters instead of the current 28 meters, back when it was released. However, it was actually strongest in a more specific instance, and post the nerf to the aura reduction. Where it became overpowered was when it was used on Doctor. Originally, when snapping out of madness against Doctor, it was considered a healing action, which meant that it worked for a nurse's cooling. This meant when both healing or snapping out of it against Doctor, you were able to see where survivors were, giving you a whole lot of information, slowdown, and more. Overall, it was a strong perk, and still probably is quite strong, but in the instance of Doctor, it could well have been considered overpowered for this additional effect. Weirdly enough, a perk I haven't mentioned in either of these videos is Dead Hard, which is debatably the strongest perk the game has ever seen for the survivor side. This perk was added in 1.6.0 and allowed you to boost yourself forward quite considerably, during this time negating all damage that would have been applied to you in that window. It was very good. 1.6.0 was prior to the changes to the aforementioned exhaustion, so there was a time when Dead Hard was at its peak and you were able to recover it whilst running, which is a scary thought. Dead Hard remained this way for a very long time, only being nerfed in 6.1.0, nearly 5 years after its release. Even then, it is still debated whether the reworked version that applied endurance instead was actually better for its potential distance gain. Nowadays, it's definitely the worst it's been since the 6.7.0 nerf. That much is for sure. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. Let me know your thoughts on these and any other perks you'd like to mention too down below. Thanks, and goodbye.